Bill Smullen is currently the Director of the National Security Studies Program and Professor of Public Relations at Syracuse University, upstate New York. Prior to his appointment at Syracuse, he was the Chief of Staff and for Secretary of State Colin Powell. He was also his military assistant when he was the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and this was in the late 1990s and early 2000s. A veteran of 30 years in the U.S. Army. His last assignment was as the Special Assistant to the 11th and 12th Chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Crowe and General Powell. Upon leaving active duty, he became the EA for General Powell, assisting with writing and promoting his best-selling autobiography, My American Journey. Colonel Smullen has also written his own book, which I think Mr. Mills has a copy of right there, entitled Ways and Means of Managing Up. It's a book about how to be successful in the workplace, and the most important fact that is not in this short bio is that Colonel Smullen is a 1962 graduate of this fine institution, continues to come back and give back to the institution, and I think he'll even tell you that he would like to be here someday, where it's a little warmer than it is in Syracuse, I think.
I don't know.
A little less snow, maybe. I don't know. But we would love to have him back here on a more permanent basis if that ever happens. And I know it takes two to a Rango Tango. I hope you can make that happen for us. So, without any further ado, Colonel, over to you, sir.
Jim, thank you so very much. It's great to be back here at the university. I love this place, and obviously it gave me a great start. It kicked me out the door, but it also provided me with some good skills as I went out the door. So thank you for having me back. Thank you to the Cohen Institute and to the university for that invitation. As you can see by the title of my talk, I think that in today's world in which we live, our contemporary adversary is indeed uncertainty. And it reminds me of a husband and wife who were watching TV not long ago, and they were in their 80s. And at the commercial break, the husband stood up and he said to his wife, "Sweetheart, I'm going to the kitchen to get something to eat. Can I get you anything?" And she said, "I wouldn't mind a bowl of vanilla ice cream." And he said, "Fine." But she said, "Write it down, because I know you're going to forget it." He said, "I'm going to be just fine. Is there anything else you want?" And she said, "Well, I wouldn't mind if you put some strawberries on the vanilla ice cream, but that's two things, so please write them both down, because you're going to forget one or both." "I'm going to be fine," he said. "Is there anything else?" "Yes, I wouldn't mind if you put some whipped cream on the strawberries and ice cream, but please write them all down, because it's going to be hopeless if you don't." He said, "I'm going to be just fine." And he left and he went into the kitchen, and he was gone for about 20 minutes. And when he came back, he handed her a dish of bacon and eggs. And she said, "You forgot the toast. I told you to write them down." Forgetfulness is certainly in our lives, but also uncertainty is in our lives. And that's what I would like to talk to you about this afternoon. When I grew up in the military, it was easy. We had really one adversary, the former Soviet Union. There were two superpowers, and the rest of the countries of the world sort of clumped around those two superpowers for diplomatic and economic and security reasons. But now that the former Soviet Union has disappeared in its former state, we are stuck with managing global order or disorder, and that has caused immense strain. Some would even argue that the world is even in a state of partial collapse. World events make for what I term this contemporary adversary. And it makes one long for those predictable days of the Cold War that gripped us for so long. And as one of the world's two superpowers, we had certainly a fight to fight, but it's even greater today. Instead, today we have unpredictability, with the world seemingly without rules or reason. And I'll give you some examples of how that has not only surrounded us, but seemingly consumed us. The events of 9/11 started this trend, and it followed closely by two wars. As you know, we invaded Afghanistan in 2001, October, and then in 2003, we chose to invade Iraq. The president was warned of that inevitability on a number of occasions, but the first time he was warned that Al-Qaeda was coming to America was in August of 2001. He was in Crawford, Texas, vacationing, as he often did in the summertime, and the CIA briefer, they call them presidential briefers, brought a briefcase filled with missives and dispatches from a variety of places around the world. But one of the dispatches warned that Al-Qaeda had committed itself to come to America in one form or another. The president did nothing about that. John O'Neill was a former FBI director. He worked in a number of places around the country. The last was a posting in New York City as an assistant FBI director. And he kept telling his bosses, Al-Qaeda is coming to America. And his bosses continued to ignore him, to dismiss him. And finally he dismissed himself because he couldn't really appreciate the fact that he had been marginalized in the FBI for making statements that they didn't seem to take very seriously. John O'Neill was, in his retirement, or in his next stage of life, he was the security director in the World Trade Towers on September 11, 2001. In racing from Tower 1 to Tower 2 to save lives, he lost his life in that tower. How ironic. But let me tell you the most important fact that is absolutely true and we should be somewhat embarrassed about. In January of 2001, the Federal Emergency Management Administration called a bunch of folks together in Washington, D.C. People from all sectors, scientists, think tank experts, people who were futurists. And he asked them, and some of his own people, the same question. What three catastrophic events could impact the United States in a terrible way in the next decade? They deliberated for about 3 days. And at the end of their debates and discussions, they concluded that the three most likely events to occur in the United States were: 1, a terrorist attack in New York City; 2, a Category 5 hurricane in New Orleans; and 3, an earthquake in California. We did nothing about either the terrorist attacks in New York City or Hurricane Katrina in September of 2005. If you know there's a problem and don't do something about it, you're bound to suffer the consequences. And surely we have. We have lots of other unpredictabilities that have occurred in the past few years. The so-called Arab Revolution that began in 2011 and caused 4 countries to unravel and their leaders to be disposed. If you think about it, we should have asked ourselves the question in 2009. If the Iranian people came out in the streets of Tehran to protest the illegal re-election of Ahmadinejad, and some of them risked their lives, some of them lost their lives to do that. If that kind of reaction could occur because of dissatisfaction in that part of the world, where else could we have similar instances? We didn't do that. There was no strategic thinking in that regard, and that is most unfortunate. Clearly, we've watched the European Union, which has stumbled from recession to recession, and it has called into question not only the future of that union, but the common currency even in the union itself. And if that were to occur, we would have financial catastrophes all over the world. In Asia, China has risen up in power, but has proved to be assertive, reckless, and insecure. Russia seems to dominate its neighbors through local proxies and to reassert itself on the world stage by engaging in places like Syria. They are now very much engaged both on the ground and in the air in Syria. North Korea's nuclear arsenal and Iran's effort, until we cut the deal with them, to develop one has caused uneasiness in various parts of the world. And it has tempted neighbors to consider what it would do if countries like Iran or North Korea were to develop a nuclear program that had the muscle that could cause catastrophic disasters around the world. Even as Al-Qaeda fades in importance relatively, its jihadist offshoot, like ISIS, are metastasizing elsewhere in places like Syria, Iraq, and even Libya. And the problem posed by the militant recruits who go to join the ISIS fight at the rate of about 1,000 per month are a threat to the homeland as well. At least 20,000 foreign nationals from roughly 90 different countries have gone to Syria and Iraq to join the fight. Most have joined ISIS. Yes, they've become foreign combatants because A, they're lured on social media to do that. B, they're promised money when they get there. And C, the romantic idea that given a weapon, they can do pretty much whatever they want to people in the territories that they occupy. All incentives to join this Islamic State. And the thrill of doing that has caused clearly a problem for the rest of the world. They're already beginning to return home, brainwashed from their experiences as a budding terrorist, ready to either form or join sleeper cells to continue their mayhem. And they can do it here in America. The shooting incident in Garland, Texas, back in May of 2015 illustrates the danger. ISIS inspires people who want to do something while they're in their own homeland, as opposed to going to places like Syria, to take up the charge, to create havoc, to kill people, to do things that are untoward. And in Garland, Texas, those two men who tried to assassinate free speech advocates were sympathizers or operatives, we're not sure. But what we do know is that they were motivated to do what they do because of an ISIS link. Or the shooting and death of 4 Marines and a Navy seaman in mid-July of this year in Chattanooga, Tennessee, by a Kuwait-born, locally raised 24-year-old who was ISIS-inspired and wanted to kill U.S. military personnel because ISIS has urged anybody who wants to be on their side and to fight their fight to find military personnel that they can take to a very different place. And unless we can defeat ISIS and that radicalism that they are creating and conducting, it will prevail for decades. The former Chief of Staff of the United States Army, Ray Odierno, recently retired. In one of his farewell interviews, he was asked, "What's the greatest threat, General?" He said, "ISIS." "And how long will this threat endure, General?" he was asked. And he said, "For the next 10 to 20 years. 10 to 20 years? Are we going to tolerate that? Will we stand for that? So 9/11 offered a glimpse of the complexity in the future, which revealed contradictions and shifting allegiances of the 21st century. The Edward Snowden intelligence leaks in 2013 played a role in the rise of ISIS. It gave valuable insights in terms of how we gather intelligence, how we analyze intelligence, and how we respond to the intelligence capability that is provided us. So Snowden opened the Pandora's box, and the result has been problematic. As of today, 62 Americans from 19 different states here in the United States have joined the ISIS fight. More than a fifth of them are women. They have chosen to become party to it because of the romance of it. And there's no single ethnic profile. They're relatively young. A quarter of them are teenagers, the youngest being 15. More than 200 Americans have traveled or attempted to travel to Syria, not necessarily to join ISIS, but to join a fight that they consider more important than what they could do if they stayed here in America. So what can we do here at home? Well, first of all, intelligence is critical. It needs to be shared at every level, local, state, and federal. FBI Director James Comey and Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson are leading the collaboration to bring people together to fight the fight back here at home. And they have urged a counter-narrative to the ISIS narrative, which is very prominent. Comey said on May the 7th of this year that hundreds, maybe thousands of people across the country in all 50 states are receiving recruitment overtures daily from ISIS. ISIS militants are prolific posters on social media. Tens of thousands of posts daily are sent asking people to join the jihad. That's the bad news. The good news is that they provide our intelligence operatives the ability to monitor their postings and determine what their goals and objectives are so that we can provide some counter evidence to that goal. It's perfectly legal to do this, and we should be doing more of it. We need to create plural systems in America that build a resilience to the threat and accept the vulnerability. If we're too slow or we get it wrong, we're going to suffer the consequences. So we need to get smarter, and we need to get better at doing that. In my view, we have been guilty of a means-ends mismatch. We have devoted inadequate resources, in my view, to the goal of degrading and eventually destroying ISIS. And if we don't devise a smarter strategy, says former Deputy CIA Director Michael Morrell, who has spoken at my program, very respected gentleman, in his book, The Great War of Our Time, he predicted that we're going to see another 9/11 attack in America very, very soon. In 2004, there were 21 Islamic terrorist groups spread out in 18 countries. Today, there are 41 Islamic terrorist groups spread out in 24 countries. So global terrorism is increasing in intensity, with numbers having risen by 81% between 2013 and 2014. In 2014 alone, 13,500 terror attacks occurred around the world. 60% of them, yes, in places like Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, and Nigeria. But 13,500, and that number is growing. Interestingly, the U.S. turned 239 years old on July 4th of this year. ISIS became 1 year old in July of this year as well. So they haven't been in existence very long, but they certainly, in the year and a half that they have been in existence, they have created a major problem for us. There are other problems which have arisen. We have hostilities between different ethnic and religious groups. Israel and the Palestinians being the two most prominent in my mind, and things are getting bloodier. They are already talking about a third intifada. Technological advances that pose threats such as cyber attacks continue to grow, larger and more lethal. 22 million federal employee personnel records were compromised in the past year. Political conflict among the world's great powers is at a higher pitch than at any time since the end of the Cold War. Hundreds of thousands of immigrants, as you know, have flooded into Europe in the past several weeks alone. And we're not sure, Europe isn't sure, the United States isn't sure on how to handle that flow and that flood. So what's the U.S. to do about this uncertainty? I've given you a lot of uncertainty. Are we to be the global cop? Some would like or safely ignore chaos and disorder around the globe. How should an American president, and we'll have a new one next year, next year elected, and in January of 2017 sworn in. How is our next president going to navigate through this world of ambitious rogues and nervous freelancers? Every president has had a nemesis. Carter had Iran. Reagan had Lebanon. Clinton had the Balkans. Bush 42 had Iraq. Bush 43 had Iraq. And Obama, of course, has had Syria. How can the U.S. enforce relevant global norms? How can we deter enemies and reassure friends without losing sight of our priority or our national interest? That job is made more difficult because the U.S. is less able to build coalitions, to forge trade agreements, to win support with sanctions, to broker international compromise, or to persuade others to follow our lead than at any time since World War II. Now, for an infantryman who was taught to close with and destroy the enemy, the solution seems simple. In my opinion, walking away from all this chaos and trouble in the world that is facing us is not an option. We have the money and we have the might to be that global cop who sets things straight. Yet our sour experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq, and they are sour, have given us pause. The blood and the treasure that we have lost in those places has generated a reluctance to interfere in efforts that do not guarantee strategic gains. So what is the answer to this conundrum facing us? Well, part of the answer lies in having the requisite capability to reinforce rules that are established and declared and enforced. It seems to me that we need to make a prudent and effective course adjustment. Americans have lived in a relatively disorderly world for so long, we have become somewhat complacent about maintaining it. Yes, we talk a good game, like threatening Syrian President Assad with the use of force, which President Obama did, for using sarin gas to murder about 1,000 people near Damascus in 2013, or denouncing the Kremlin when Russia seized Crimea in 2014, or just last week bemoaning Russia's military expansion into Syria. The language is elegant, the words are true, yet the warnings rarely amount to much. Our policies appear incoherent. Sure, Assad gave up much of his chemical arsenal, but is still slaughtering people with chlorine gas instead of sarin gas, which is still problematic for the people of Syria. And yes, a handful of Russian tycoons have been sanctioned, yet Russian soldiers have either been on the border or inside the Ukraine for long periods of time over the past several months, and clearly Russia is now fairly well ensconced in Syria, both on the ground and in the air. Rules are invoked, but not enforced. Principles are idealized, but not defended. The most urgent goal of U.S. foreign policy over the next decade would be to arrest the continuous slide into an abyss of international disorder. In order to do that, we need to deter such disorder, not just react verbally to it. We need to show we can lead by taking the things that are possible to achieve and showing adult-centered leadership in doing those things that are uplifting or positive. There's a growing awareness we can't withdraw from the world and allow unraveling to take place. Violations of geopolitical norms, such as the use of chemical weapons, need to be punished swiftly and precisely, targeting the perpetrators of the attacks. Short, mission-specific punitive actions, not open-ended occupations like we have experienced in Iraq, are necessary as a deterrent, in my view. Such a foreign policy would not try to run every bad guy out of town and would not demand that the U.S. put out every geopolitical fire itself. It would require a game plan that would rely heavily on an enduring inner logic that anticipates better such things as failed states, failed transitions, societal collapse, massive migrations, cross-border incursions, and criminalized politics. It would bring to bear available resources. What are they? Well, they're political means, economic means, diplomatic means, and of course military means. And they need to be brought into action at a decisive point where they could and should be deployed to confront an objective or an adversary. Diplomacy when it can be achieved, but strength when it is necessary. We have lacked a credible grand strategy with respect to U.S. foreign policy, in my view, for years, and it has cost us credibility as the leader of the free world. A grand strategy is not especially esoteric. It is the calculated relationship of determining means to ends while addressing the what and the how of responding intelligently so as to advance our vital national interest. It takes into consideration resources available, costs involved, political consequences, as well as risks and ramifications associated with our established objectives. Simply put, strategy is where vision and action come together. It demands clear thinking about long-term goals and objectives. It is operational as well as aspirational. I can think of 5 attributes or characteristics of a reasonable grand strategy. What are they? First, it must be balanced to ensure that certain competing interests, such as security, economics, and values, are properly aligned. Second, it must be prudent so as to strike the correct balance between maintaining our role as a global leader while ensuring we do not face strategic exhaustion. Third, it must be principled and built on values leaders can point to and public opinion can support. Fourth, it must be purposive, which is to say it must advance America's interest and ideals while articulating a positive vision for the future. And fifth, it must be sustainable, so it can endure over several administrations and can be readily supported by the American people because it has a prioritized set of strategic means and ends. In the realm of foreign policy, a strategy seeks to move the ship of state closer to its destination. Is such a grand strategy proposal fail-safe, or will it operate without error or fault? Of course not. But it beats suffering from what I call STD, strategic thinking deficiency, something that has plagued this country for far too long. Helpful to this cause is the need to have a vigorous national debate about the ends or the means or the exits available to us for anything we advocate doing. We didn't have that before we invaded Iraq in 2003. There was no debate in the Congress. There was no debate in the press. The case for engaging Islamic State extremists for remaining on the sidelines is, in my view, the biggest question before not just the Congress but the President at the moment. And the debate over the authorized use of military force, which the Congress has said they will not vote on because there is no strategy to support the use of military force. So the clash of armies and ideas is the issue. The entire civilized world has a lot at stake in the outcome. Not since World War II has a conflict touched and engulfed so many countries and so many people. We cannot afford to get this wrong. Should we use smart power, soft power, or hard power in a progressive form or not? First of all, it would translate to the use of smart power, which is the use of intelligent opportunism. Secondly, the use of soft power, which is the use of diplomatic initiative. And last but not least, if those two fail, the use of hard power, which is the use of military force. In the case of the latter, It would require the U.S. to recalculate because we would need to increase military spending. Yes, it has just been bumped up with the latest budget deal, but it needs to be much larger with regard to financing our military requirements. It would also require that GDP be advanced from about 3.5% upward to about 5% of GDP. We would need the defense industry to begin working harder at research and development. With the reduction in the defense budget, R&D is a very low priority in the minds of most corporations that do defense planning and development. Why? Because the money simply is not there. And we would need to enable our services to be much smarter. The Navy, for example, has long stated the need for 313 ships, down now to about 290 ships, and that's too few. We would need to enable the Air Force to replace its aircraft fleet, whose planes are about 26 years old on average. And we would need to stop the reduction in the size of our United States Army. It was at 540,000 a year or so ago. It's gone down to about 490, and plans are for it to reduce to 450,000, yet the requirements continue to go up. Any strategy at any time deserves the vigorous review, or what we call in the military an IPR, an in-progress review. And as Sir Winston Churchill so wisely once said, quote, "However beautiful the strategy, you should occasionally look at the results," unquote. The art of compromise is lacking in Washington, as you well know. And unless we restore it to the process of governing, inertia will result. The Latin word gubernare comes to mind. Gubernare means to steer, to control. In the face of broad uncertainty, we need to steer strategically. Our foreign policy must be built on nimble diplomacy and the building of coalitions. The U.S. can't do it all and can't do it alone. 19th century English author Lewis Carroll once said, "If you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there." And that's the path we're on today. We need a GPS system that allows us to deal effectively with those uncertain challenges that lie ahead. So what's the answer to all of this? Well, history is not on our side. Let me take the National Security Council, which is part of the problem, in ways that it's too bloated, it's too complex. The National Security Council was created during the Truman administration. It consisted of three people: the President, the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of State. When Carter came into office, years later, it was increased to 25 people. When Reagan was president, it was increased to 50 people. When Clinton was in office, to 100 people. With Bush, 43 to 200 people. And when Obama became president, he increased the size of the National Security Council to 400 people, which is the size at which it is at today. It is part of the problem, not part of the solution. As you well know, our National Security Council is responsible for advising the President on strategy, what we should do diplomatically, economically, militarily to get the job done. But it doesn't have the focus on the future. It's too busy handling the numerous crises and catastrophes each and every day. So in order for the President to be better informed, like the Weather Service, we need to have a forecasting system which would allow the President to prepare better for what lies ahead. If I were king for a day, I would assemble a strategic cell. For the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to call it an Insight Council. Not too large, but led by an iconic figure who would assemble a combination of talents. Talents like a historian, a diplomat, an economist, a political scientist, a military strategist, a research specialist, a hard scientist, a futurist, an anthropologist, a communicator, a psychologist, and other strategic minds as are needed. The goal of the team would be to engage each and every day in strategic management on behalf of the President, apart from the National Security Council. And it would have the ability to think strategically and to plan strategically on behalf of the President. They are not one and the same, as you well know. Strategic thinking is connecting the dots between the past, the present, and the future. And then the planning, strategic planning, is the invention of ideas. Where do you take that thinking to incorporate it into action? With one common goal, the Strategic Insight Council would advise the President so he or she can act with greater knowledge so as to make the best decisions possible on behalf of the nation and the American people. Collectively, they would occupy a space near and have unfettered access to the President. They would help convert uncertainty to the best and the most reasonable hope for a path ahead based on intelligent and decent purpose. This is a rare and unprecedented time in history. The U.S. needs to seize the moment as the world's leading liberal democratic nation and rediscover the meaning of Pax Americana. If our red lines are exposed as mere bluffs, more of them will be crossed. If our commitments to our allies are not serious, those allies might ignore or abandon us. If our threats are empty, our enemies will be emboldened, and we will have more of them. The U.S. can and should lead by example and responsibly contribute to making the world a better place. Some suggest the United States is in decline. I respectfully disagree with that notion. We have the world's most formidable military, the world's largest economy. Economic recovery is still strong in 2015, and our capacity for technological innovation will continue to grow. America, in my view, has a bright 21st century future, but we need to shine the beacon of possibility and hope around the world. We need to conquer the uncertainty of the day and help bring stability, prosperity, dignity, and peace to billions around the world by making strategically wise and prudent foreign policy decisions. The world is watching, as one of my friends, Sister Carol, said not long ago. Sister Carol is a non-Catholic nun in an elementary school in Syracuse. And recently she was monitoring the fifth grade boys' lunch line. And the boys were a little bit precocious that day, taking a little bit more than their fair share of food. So Sister Carol created a tent sign, and she put it at the head of the lunch line. And her sign said, it was right next to the big bowl of red apples. And her sign said, "Take but one. God is watching." One of the precocious ones took a piece of paper out of his pocket, and he wrote his own little note, and he made his own little tent sign. And he put it right next to the big bowl of chocolate chip cookies at the end of the lunch line. And his sign said, "Take as many as you want. God's watching the bowl of red apples." If you think about it, the whole world is watching the United States and what it does or fails to do at this very important time in our history. I hope we make the right decisions to make it a better world in which we live. I'll pause there and open it up to any questions that you may have or expand on anything I've already spoken to. Thank you very much. Jim.
Well, we had the opportunity to sit with Secretary Cohen, General Rawlston, and Ambassador Burns last week or 2 weeks ago. It was very recently, though. And it was kind of neat because the SPIA students spent about an hour and 15 minutes with him, very first thing before he gave a talk to a different audience. And the very first question he got was it was a softball question. It had a really unique answer. You kind of delved upon it a little bit with your presentation. And the question was in reference to General Dunford's confirmation hearings, asking what's the greatest threat that he thinks, and his answer has been Russia. And that's what he said during the confirmation hearings. And so there's been some questions about, is that the greatest threat that we face? And so that was the question that was posed to Secretary Cohen. So General Ralston answered her first, and he said yes. Well, he's a uniformed guy. Jennifer is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs Staff, so okay. Ambassador Burns went off on a little bit of a different tangent, and then Secretary Cohen had a rather unique answer. And I'm kind of curious about your perspective on this. And Secretary Cohen said the greatest threat we face is ourselves, is our inability in Washington, and this is in respect to foreign policy, our inability in Washington to get out of our own way. This is a point in time when the world is watching what the United States does closely, and watches, and when we say the world, we mean world governments. And they're watching what we do in Washington, and how we either are acting as world policemen or not, or how we are supporting our allies or not. And our actions have not been leadership-like. And the example he threw out at that very time is we have the number 3 most powerful position in all of the U.S. government, and nobody wants it. Nobody wanted to be Speaker of the House at that point. So he went on to talk just a little bit about how we are our own worst enemies with respects to foreign policy, and that the world is watching where we go, and that if we don't do this right, we will drive countries in the Far East to a China-centric model, and we will drive countries that are on the fringes of the Russia, but we're going to do that if we don't pay attention. And he says that is our greatest security threat, our inability to get out of our own way in Washington. Agree, disagree, or thoughts on that?
Well, it's a threat. I'm not sure it's the greatest threat. We clearly have lost our way. We clearly have lost the art of compromise. We clearly can't agree on a direction in which we want to take the country. Part of that is partisan politics. Part of that, quite frankly, as I look at the Congress today compared to the Congress that I observed when I was still on active duty, I spent a lot of time on the Hill with the Secretary and the Chief of Staff of the Army and 2 Chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and then the Secretary of State. Spent a lot of time on the Hill. And what we found as we traveled that road at that particular point in time is that there were very senior people, graybeards as I call them, who could stand up in front of their colleagues and say, stop it already. We've got a job to do. And we're doing that job on behalf of the American people. And so let's find that middle ground. Let's find that compromise. Let's find that right direction. So they're right in the fact that it's a problem. I'm not sure it's a threat in the true sense of the word. The threat, in my view, is the same threat that we experienced on 9/11, and ISIS clearly is devoted to doing something that is going to be catastrophic, just as Al-Qaeda did, just as allegedly ISIS did with the airplane that came down over Egypt. They can create havoc, and if they create havoc, as Michael Morrell said, it's bound to happen. They are going to create a psychological scar in our brains as a people here in America, and we're going to have to fight that fight. So, in my view, Russia's a problem. Those military officers that identified Russia are victims of their past. That's what we grew up with. My 30 years in the Army, the only adversary I worried about was Russia. And they're still in a kind of a hangover stage from that era. So, of course, they're going to be concerned about Russia. And Russia's a problem. I would put it probably number 2 on the list of problems. North Korea is a problem. Kim Jong-un, he's trying to build a nuclear arsenal. His goal is to develop a ballistic missile that can hit the west coast of the United States. Is that a problem? It's a big problem. Is that a threat? It's a big threat. So we've got many threats. But the thing about ISIS that bothers me the most is that, different from Al-Qaeda, who wants to punch you in the nose and then retreat and disappear so that you can't fight them, which is what they have been doing for years, ISIS not only goes into a city, whether it's in Iraq or Afghanistan, and takes the city, but then they occupy the city, and they take over the city, and they create havoc. So they are much more territorial in their approach, and I think unless we can rout them out. Unless we can destroy them, and I mean destroy them, I don't mean just cause them a problem. We need to destroy them. And if you took the 10th Mountain Division from Fort Drum, New York, and sent them to that part of the world, they could do it in a very short period of time, in my view. But we're not doing that because we're afraid to do that. We're exhausted from Iraq and Afghanistan, and so we are the victims of our own lack of insight with regard to how we're going to handle these problems. Once again, strategic thinking deficiency. We had it during the Bush administration, and I was part of that administration. And we have had it during the Obama administration. So the threats are many. You can try to prioritize them, and you may have different opinions. I think we ought to be concerned about all of them and do something to prevent them from occurring that disastrous moment which they want to do. Yes, ma'am.
Colonel Smullen, thank you for coming and spending time with our students and with our ROTC cadets this morning.
Mm-hmm.
In your opinion, how can we better train and prepare our military to deal with anarchists and ISIS, these type of threats?
Well, I think I had a wonderful discussion with them this morning. They asked, what's our greatest threat? I gave them the ISIS answer, and I defended that with what they're trying to do and how long it's going to take at the rate and in the manner in which we are responding to it. And I think what we can do is to talk to them, yes, about what it takes to be a good officer in the U.S. military, but how they can think more strategically about the things that they will be confronted with as not just a young officer, but if they stay in the military for a number of years and become more senior, is they have to make more serious decisions. How do you think through an issue? As I told the two classes that I spoke to today, you're going to have conflict in your life. You're going to have crisis in your life. You're going to have risk in your professional life. And you need to know how to deal with all of those things that are going to come into your life so that you have a plan. And having a plan means to be taught how to deal with an issue when you are confronted with it. I teach crisis communications, crisis management to my students and to various audiences. And if you have a plan available to you in advance of crisis occurring, you're going to be better prepared to respond more quickly and efficiently to whatever it is that has confronted you. So I think we need to spend more time educating those young men and women on those kinds of things that are going to be party to their future in uniform, whether it's on active duty or in the National Guard or in the Reserve. They all are one force in this day and age, and no one element has more priority or authority than the other. They're all in it together as a team. So educating them in things like we have talked about today with regard to the uncertainty that exists out there is something that I think we just need to keep harping on and educating them on in terms of the solutions that they are going to have to impose. Yes, sir.
What do you think about the United Nations as far as the role they play today, and are they effective throughout the world?
I think the United Nations is very ineffective. They're not sure of what they can do and how quickly they need to do it, and they tend to sit on the sidelines far longer than they should when there is a global problem of some impact and some concern. And they don't have a voice, they don't take a stand, and they don't participate in a solution. Talk a lot about the problem, they sit around in that body having discussions about the problem. I think what we need to do is send smarter, or not smarter, but the smartest ambassadors possible to the United Nations to represent our cause. And if you've got a smart ambassador who can negotiate or navigate the waters of that body, you're going to be much more able to influence how they respond to some of the crises around the world. But I think the UN has become rather incapable of doing what they should be doing, which is providing that conscience and providing some of the solutions to the problems that exist out there. So we need to, I think, send better people to the UN to contribute to that cause. Well, thank you very much for coming. I enjoyed it very much, and I hope those who get to watch this long distance will take some value from it and do something that we all can make a contribution. Even if it's having a discussion in your classrooms or at your dinner table, or if you have guests into your house. We need to have a debate as a people as to where we're going, so that when we do have that next president, fairly soon we'll be able to say to that individual, here's what you ought to do to make us more secure and more capable in this world in which we live. Thank you.